Have you ever picked up a hitchhiker? Or maybe you've been one yourself? The open road can be a place of adventure, but it can also harbor dark secrets. In this video, we'll explore the terrifying true stories of hitchhikers and those who dared to give them a ride. Buckle up, because these tales might make you think twice about stopping for a stranger. I swear, I don't pick up hitchhikers. Ever. But that night, something made me stop. Maybe it was the way he stood on the side of that empty road, drenched from the rain, or maybe it was the fact that there was no car in sight for miles. He didn't even wave me down. He just stood there, staring at the road ahead. I pulled over and rolled down the window. Need a ride? No response. He just nodded, climbed into the passenger seat, and shut the door. His clothes were soaked. His hood was up, casting a shadow over his face. His hands, pale and bony, rested on his lap. I cleared my throat. Where you headed? Nothing. Not a single word. Just a slow turn of the head in my direction, then back to the road. My stomach tightened. Something about him felt off. I should have turned back right then. Should have kicked him out. But I didn't. The rain pounded against my windshield, and the wipers screeched back and forth. Silence filled the car, thick and suffocating. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The tension sat heavy on my chest. That's when the radio crackled. The station changed by itself. A static-filled voice whispered something I couldn't understand. My heart pounded. I turned the dial, but it wouldn't budge. The air inside the car grew colder. My breath fogged up the glass. The smell of damp earth filled my nostrils, thick and rotten. My grip on the steering wheel tightened. That's when I noticed it. The hitchhiker's reflection in the rearview mirror. But when I turned to look at him directly, he was still facing forward. My fingers went numb. This was no ordinary passenger. I forced a chuckle, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. You don't talk much, huh? No response. My fingers tapped the wheel. I needed noise, something to break the tension. I reached for my phone, but the screen flickered and shut off. Dead battery. I frowned. It was fully charged before I left. The road stretched ahead, endless and empty. Not a single car in sight. Just darkness pressing in from all sides. My headlights barely cut through the fog rolling in. That's when it happened. The radio crackled again. A new voice, raspy and distant. 2 words. Help me. My blood ran cold. I turned the radio off, but it turned back on by itself. The same words. Over and over. Help me. A chill spread through my veins. I glanced at the hitchhiker. He hadn't moved. Not an inch. His hands were still on his lap, his face hidden beneath the hood. But something in the air changed. The pressure inside the car felt heavier, suffocating. The dashboard lights flickered. The engine sputtered for a second, like it was going to stall. I swallowed hard. What the hell is going on? Then, the glove compartment flew open, slamming into my knee. A folded piece of paper slipped out. My breath hitched. With trembling fingers, I reached down and picked it up. It was damp, the ink smeared. 3 words were scrawled across the page. Asterisk, asterisk, don't look back. Asterisk, asterisk. My pulse thundered in my ears. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The reflection, the hitchhiker's face, was finally visible. And it wasn't human. A distorted face stared back at me. Hollow eyes sunk deep into a pale, stretched face. The mouth was wide, too wide, like it had been torn open. I gasped, jerking the wheel. The car swerved violently. My heart slammed against my ribs. I snapped my head toward the passenger seat. The hitchhiker hadn't moved. He was still sitting there, hood up, hands resting on his lap. But the reflection, that thing in the mirror, was grinning. My breath came in short gasps. I squeezed my eyes shut for half a second, trying to steady myself. When I opened them, the reflection was gone. My knuckles turned white around the steering wheel. My hands were shaking. I needed to get this guy out of my car. Now. Hey man, I croaked, voice barely steady. I think this is as far as I can take you. No response. He didn't even blink. The static on the radio stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, slowly, he raised one hand and pointed forward. My stomach twisted. What? What do you want? He didn't answer, but the car did. The engine roared without me touching the gas. The headlights flickered, casting shadows that twisted and stretched. The air inside felt thick, like I was breathing underwater. The road ahead curved sharply, but I couldn't slow down. The brakes, they weren't working. I stomped the pedal, yanked the wheel, but the car was in control of something else now, something I couldn't see. I turned to the hitchhiker, eyes wide with panic. "What the hell are you doing?" That's when he finally moved. He turned his head slowly, and I saw what was under the hood. I don't know what I expected to see under that hood, maybe just a regular guy, some drifter with a weird way of traveling, but what I saw, it wasn't human. His skin was grayish, stretched too tight over his skull like something had drained the life from him long ago. Deep, hollow sockets stared at me where his eyes should have been, but the worst part was his mouth. It hung open in a silent scream, lips torn, exposing jagged, rotting teeth. My stomach clenched. A suffocating stench of decay filled the car, thick and overwhelming. My vision blurred. I gagged, covering my nose with one trembling hand. The car was still speeding forward, the brakes completely useless. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen in place, locked under the weight of an unseen force. The hitchhiker didn't blink, didn't breathe, just sat there with that gaping, unnatural expression. Then, the whispering started again. The voice from the radio, only now it was coming from inside the car, all around me. "Help me, don't leave me, help me." My heart pounded against my ribs, wild and erratic. I clawed at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The road ahead twisted and turned, but I couldn't slow down. The speedometer climbed higher, the car groaning under the pressure. My pulse thundered in my ears. I had to get out. Now. The hitchhiker raised his hand again, pointing. His fingers trembled, his lips moved, but no sound came out. His entire body shook like he was struggling against something unseen. And then, the worst sound I have ever heard in my life. A scream, not from his mouth, from everywhere. It was raw, agonized, inhuman, and the road ahead, it just disappeared. The car plunged forward into nothingness. One moment I was gripping the wheel, fighting for control, and the next, I was weightless, free-falling into a void darker than the night itself. My stomach flipped, my screams lost in the deafening roar of wind. My headlights flickered, illuminating twisted shadows that stretched and morphed into something unnatural. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing, a road that shouldn't exist, floating in midair, surrounded by absolute blackness. The hitchhiker remained still, unfazed. The car hit something solid again, slamming back onto a narrow, crumbling road that hadn't been there a second ago. My tires screeched. Sparks flew as I yanked the wheel to regain control. My arms shook. My breath came in ragged gasps. I was alive, but I wasn't safe. The hitchhiker lifted his head. His hollow eyes locked onto mine, and suddenly, my head was full of memories that weren't mine. I saw flashes, blood-soaked asphalt, a car twisted into unrecognizable wreckage. A man crawling from the wreckage, his mouth moving, trying to scream but making no sound. My pulse skittered. This wasn't the first time someone had picked him up, and they had never made it back. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but I knew I wasn't in my world anymore. The lines on the pavement curved in impossible ways. The trees outside weren't trees at all, but writhing shapes reaching toward the car. My fingers ached from gripping the wheel. The hitchhiker turned to me one final time, his mouth stretching wider. And then, the car started slowing down. Something was waiting ahead. I should have been relieved that the car was finally slowing, that the relentless speeding had stopped. But I wasn't, because I could see where I was headed. A town, but not like any town I'd ever seen before. Streetlights flickered, casting long, unnatural shadows. The buildings were old, too old, their windows black and empty. The road led straight into its heart, where a single figure stood beneath a flickering street lamp, waiting. My breathing turned shallow. The car coasted to a stop directly in front of the figure. I didn't want to look, but I did. It was him, the hitchhiker, standing outside. But how? I turned slowly to my right. The passenger seat was empty. The door never opened. The air was thick with something unseen. pressing down on me like I was being watched from all directions. My fingers twitched over the ignition. I had to leave. The figure outside lifted his head, revealing that same twisted, gaping mouth. But his eyes, his empty, soulless eyes, were filled with something else now. A plea. Desperation. He raised one shaking hand and pointed at the passenger seat. My throat tightened. Something was still there. Something I couldn't see. The radio crackled one last time. A voice, faint, broken, whispered, "You have to take my place." The seat beside me groaned, as if something unseen had just shifted. Cold air wrapped around me like invisible fingers. The door locks clicked shut, and the car on its own began moving again. Back toward the darkness. I screamed. I yanked at the door handle, slammed my fists against the window, but it was useless. The car was moving on its own, back toward the endless black road, away from the town, away from any chance of escape. My pulse pounded in my ears. I twisted in my seat, looking behind me, searching for something, anything, that made sense, but there was only the road, and it was stretching longer. The hitchhiker outside didn't follow. He stood still beneath the flickering street lamp, watching me, his face contorted in something like relief. He was free, and I was not. The car picked up speed, the engine humming in a way I'd never heard before. The air inside thickened. I wasn't alone. Something invisible sat beside me, its presence like an unbearable weight. I felt it watching, listening, waiting. The radio crackled again, a low whisper crawling through the speakers. "Help me. Don't leave me." Tears burned in my eyes. I gritted my teeth, forcing my trembling hands to grip the wheel. No, I won't do this. The road beneath me twisted. The horizon spun. I slammed my foot on the brake, but nothing happened. I was trapped. The engine roared. The air grew so heavy I could barely breathe. My vision blurred. My heart pounded one last time. And then, silence. Darkness. The car stopped. The passenger door clicked open. My breath caught. My body refused to move. I could feel it. Something shifting beside me, stepping out. The car was empty again. And the road behind me? Another pair of headlights appeared in the distance. A lone driver, unaware. A new hitchhiker waiting on the roadside. The cycle was about to begin again. I was driving down a lonely highway, the kind that stretches for miles without a single turn. The air was thick with mist, and my headlights barely cut through the darkness. That's when I saw him. A man standing by the side of the road, drenched from head to toe, his clothes clinging to his body as if he had just crawled out of a river. He lifted one hand, motioning for me to stop. Something inside me said I shouldn't, but my foot was already easing off the gas. The moment my car rolled to a stop, he stepped closer. His face was pale, his eyes wide with urgency. "There's an accident ahead," he said, voice shaking. "A truck. It's blocking the road. If you keep driving, you won't survive." My chest tightened. His voice wasn't a warning. It was a plea. I hesitated, glancing at the empty road. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, just the endless darkness. I swallowed hard and nodded. "All right," I said, gripping the wheel. "I'll turn around." As I drove away, I checked my mirror. The man was gone. I pulled into a gas station a few miles back, my heart still pounding. The attendant gave me a strange look as I parked. "Something wrong?" he asked. I hesitated. The whole thing felt ridiculous now. A ghostly hitchhiker warning me about a crash? I must have looked paranoid. But then I saw them. A group of men laughing near their motorcycles, gassing up. One of them was talking about the open road, how they had plans to speed through the highway without stopping for anything. My stomach twisted. I stepped forward, voice dry in my throat. "You should avoid the highway ahead," I said. They barely glanced at me. "Some guy told me there's a wreck," I continued. "He said no one makes it through." They exchanged amused glances. One of them scoffed, throwing his helmet on. "Sounds like a drunk messing with you," he muttered. Another revved his engine. "Ghost stories don't scare us." My fingers clenched into fists as I watched them speed off into the night. disappearing into the same road I had just escaped. A sinking feeling settled in my gut. I had warned them, but I knew they wouldn't make it back. I stayed at the gas station longer than I should have. Something told me I needed to wait. And then, it happened. The distant sound of sirens, the kind that cut through the night like a blade. A few minutes later, a truck driver stumbled in, breathless, his face pale as death. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "That wreck up ahead, you wouldn't believe it." A group of bikers went straight into a jackknife truck. No time to stop. It was like they didn't even see it. My blood ran cold. The bikers. The ones who didn't listen. The ones who laughed at my warning. My stomach twisted as I gripped the counter. "Anyone survive?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The trucker shook his head, eyes hollow. "Cops are on the scene now, but..." His voice trailed off and his face darkened. "There's something weird about it. One of the officers said a guy flagged him down earlier, told him about the accident before it even happened." My breath caught in my throat. "A hitchhiker?" I whispered. The trucker nodded slowly. "Yeah, but here's the thing. When they went to find him, he was gone." I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pale face of the man on the road. I heard his voice again and again, repeating those words. "If you keep driving, you won't survive." I thought about the bikers, how they had ignored the warning, how they never got another chance. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Who was he? Was he trying to save people? Or was he something worse? The idea sent a shiver down my spine. By morning, I convinced myself it had all been a coincidence, a cruel twist of fate. But as I turned on the news, my breath hitched. They were covering the accident, the bikers, the truck, the deaths, and then the reporter said something that made my skin crawl. Witnesses reported seeing a man standing by the highway before the crash. A hitchhiker. But when police arrived, there was no trace of him. I felt my hands go numb. He wasn't real, or at least, not alive. I told myself I'd never go near that road again, but something pulled me back. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was fear, maybe I just needed to know the truth. Days later, I drove that same stretch of highway, my heart hammering. The road was quiet, empty. The crash had been cleared. But the moment I reached the spot where I first saw him, my headlights flickered, my car sputtered, and then, out of the darkness, there he was, standing in the same spot, soaking wet, staring straight at me. My pulse pounded in my ears. This time I didn't stop. I slammed the gas, racing past him, but as I sped forward, I felt a chill creep up my spine. Slowly, I glanced in the rearview mirror. My heart stopped. He was in my back seat. I couldn't breathe. My hands clenched the wheel, my knuckles white. "Why didn't you listen?" The voice was barely a whisper, but it filled the entire car. My vision blurred as I felt my body go cold. My foot pressed harder on the gas, but the road seemed endless. "You were supposed to turn around." My throat tightened. "I did." I choked out. "I left. I warned the others. Then why are you here?" My blood turned to ice. I didn't know. I didn't know why I had come back, but something told me I had made a mistake. A terrible mistake. I blinked, and suddenly the world around me shifted. The road was no longer empty. Headlights flashed. Horns blared. My heart slammed into my ribs as I realized I was in the middle of the highway. A truck was barreling straight toward me. I wrenched the wheel, my tires screeching against the asphalt. The car spun, metal screaming as I crashed into the guardrail. And then, everything went silent. My head lolled to the side. Blood dripped down my forehead. My breath was shallow, and as my vision faded, I saw him, standing outside my car, watching, waiting. I woke up in the hospital, my body aching, my mind trapped in a fog. The nurses told me I was lucky to be alive, but as I stared at the ceiling, I felt it, the truth sinking in. The hitchhiker, he wasn't saving people. He was leading them to their fate. The ones who listened were spared. The ones who didn't never left that highway. And now, I was one of them. Stuck in a cycle. A warning, a crash, a vanishing figure. I turned my head toward the window. Outside, in the darkened reflection, I saw him, and this time, he was smiling. The photograph trembles in my hands as I write this. I need to share what happened last night, not just for my sanity, but as a warning to others. I've driven the midnight shift on Route 43 for 15 years, and nothing prepared me for this. It started like any other rainy night. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. when my headlights caught a figure on the roadside. Just another hitchhiker, I thought. Nothing unusual for these back roads. I'm not usually the type to pick up strangers, but something about this one was different. Maybe it was the old-fashioned clothes, or the way they stood so still in the pouring rain. I pulled over, telling myself it was just common decency. The passenger door creaked open, and a gust of cold air filled my car. That's when I should have noticed. The rain wasn't hitting them. Not a single drop. The stranger slid into the passenger seat with an unsettling grace. "Heading south?" they asked, voice soft as cemetery wind. I nodded, trying to get a better look at their face in the dim light. They wore an outdated suit, like something from an old movie, yet it seemed brand new. The collar was crisp, the fabric unwrinkled. "Been waiting long?" I asked, more to fill the silence than anything else. They smiled. At least, I think they did. "Oh, time doesn't mean much out here," they replied. "I've seen so many cars pass by, so many drivers." Something about the way they said it made my skin crawl. As we drove, the radio started crackling, then died completely. The silence that followed felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on us. "Would you like to hear a story?" they asked, still staring straight ahead. I've collected quite a few over the years. Before I could respond, they began speaking about a truck driver from 1953. The details were vivid, too vivid. They described the driver's plaid jacket, the coffee stain on his collar, even the brand of cigarettes in his pocket. The story ended with the driver vanishing on this very road, his truck found empty, engine still running. "They never found him," my passenger said, but I remember the look in his eyes when he realized. They trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging in the dark air between us. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to ignore the way the temperature seemed to drop with each word they spoke. More stories followed, each more disturbing than the last. A young couple in 1967, a traveling salesman in 1975, a college student in 1982, all disappeared on this stretch of road. The way they told each story, it was like they had been there, witnessed each disappearance firsthand. The details were so precise, so personal. They knew things nobody could know unless they had been present. I started noticing other strange things too. The mile markers weren't adding up right. We should have reached the next town by now, but the road just stretched endlessly ahead. My phone had no signal, and the GPS screen showed static. Even the stars outside seemed wrong somehow, like they were arranged in unfamiliar patterns. "Do you believe in ghosts?" they suddenly asked. Their voice had changed, becoming hollow, like it was echoing from somewhere far away. I forced a laugh, but it sounded fake even to my ears. Never given it much thought, I lied. The truth was, I was starting to believe in a lot of things I hadn't before this night. They turned to face me then, and in the brief flash of a passing car's headlights, I caught a glimpse of their face. What I saw, or didn't see, made my blood run cold. But that's not the worst part. In that same flash of light, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. The back seat was filled with suitcases and bags, dozens of them, from different eras. Some looked ancient, others more modern. "Those belong to the others," they said, answering my unspoken question. "The ones who were kind enough to stop, the ones who offered me a ride." Their voice had dropped to a whisper, but somehow it filled the entire car. I wanted to stop, to get out, to run, but my feet seemed fused to the pedals. The car kept moving forward, even though I was no longer sure I was the one driving it. The road ahead started to look different, shifting and changing like a living thing. I could see other cars now, ghost-like images appearing and disappearing in the darkness. Each one contained a driver, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. I recognized them from the stories they had told me. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, My passenger pointed to a spot up ahead. "This is where I get out," they said. The car stopped on its own, engine dying without my touch. They opened the door, and for a moment, the interior light illuminated them fully. I wish it hadn't. Before stepping out, they turned back one last time. "Thanks for the ride," they said, their face splitting into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You've been much more entertaining than the others." Then they were gone, leaving behind nothing but a cold spot in the passenger seat and the lingering scent of decay. I sat there, shaking, for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe. It wasn't until morning that I found the photograph. It had slipped between the seats, an old Polaroid, yellow with age. The image shows a group of people standing in front of a car, a 1952 Chevrolet. The date stamped on the back reads the 15th of June, 1953. My passenger is there, wearing the same suit, looking exactly the same. But that's not what makes my hands shake as I write this. It's the fact that I recognize every other person in that photo. They're the same people from all the stories they told me. And in the background, partially hidden behind the car, there's another figure. It's blurry, but I can just make out what they're wearing, the same clothes I have on right now. I'm never driving that road again, but I know, somehow, that they're still out there, waiting, watching, collecting more stories, and more passengers.